Welcome everybody to the today's video conference on the organization, Israeli organization Breaking the Silence. My name is Heinz Deininger. I'm a member of the board of the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung in Baden-Württemberg, who is in charge of the event this evening. I welcome very heartily Rebecca Strober, also called Becca Strober. Nice that you could join us, Becca. Very welcome. Becca is the educational director of the organization Breaking the Silence. She is in charge of doing educational work, of telling what the organization stands for and what the members of the organization have seen during their military service in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Force in the occupied territories. Breaking the Silence was founded in 2004. Besides the educational work, they gathered testimonies of former soldiers in the IDF. And as I just heard from Rebecca, they have gathered until now up to more than 1,000 testimonies from the territories which are occupied by the Israel and the Israeli army. We scheduled this event for tonight to make the worthwhile work of this courageous organization a little bit more known in Germany. And yeah, I hope we will gather worthwhile insights into the work of the organization. Also, in the second part, into the peace process, which Breaking the Silence stands for, because the aim is to do their possible contribution to achieve peace in Israel and Palestine. And with that, I thank again, and I hand over to Becca.
Thank you, Heinz, and thank you so much for having me and Breaking the Silence this evening. I'm very happy to be here. Also a huge admirer of Rosa-Luxemburg and of the organization, so thank you very much. So as you kind of started off saying, my name is Becca Strober. I have an American accent because I was born and raised in the United States in the city of Philadelphia. And like many young Jews from the United States and from England and from kind of all over Europe, I moved to Israel when I was 18. I became a citizen and I joined the army. Before that, I grew up very strongly in a very Jewish home. And you know, I went to Jewish preschool and Jewish summer camp, and I went to synagogue a lot. My dad was the president, and kind of was raised on this value of what in Hebrew is called tikkun olam, fixing the world. And so that's kind of, I think, a concept that has carried me, at first brought me to Israel. Also, my grandmother is a Jerusalemite. My family is from Jerusalem from 1809. So, you know, that family history brought me to Jerusalem, and it is, I think, my Jewish background and caring for fixing the world that has brought me to the work that I do today. In 2008 and 2010, I served in the IDF, and I served as a shooting instructor. So I taught over 1,000 infantry soldiers how to use the most basic guns, rifles. And I taught regular riflery and sharpshooting, which means to slightly farther distances. And I also taught the light machine gun and the heavy machine gun. And because I mainly worked with infantry soldiers, almost all of those soldiers at some point after going through training with me found themselves inside the occupied territories. I often like to say I spent 2 years supporting the occupation, and I've since then spent many years trying to end the occupation. And today I direct the Department of Education at Breaking the Silence. And maybe I'll actually just share my screen. I don't have a lot of slides, but I have a few. So today I just want to, the screen that you can all see is the screen that says Breaking the Silence. Yes?
Yes, it works fine.
Okay, great. So today I direct the Department of Education at Breaking the Silence, and I'll just give a very, very short introduction as to who we are. Breaking the Silence started in Hebron. Hebron is a city in the West Bank. It's the only city in the West Bank that's a Palestinian city, but has an Israeli settlement inside of it. And Breaking the Silence started when a group of soldiers from the Nachal Brigade, from an infantry unit, got to a point where they felt they couldn't keep quiet. They felt they had to tell about what they were sent to do. And so when they got out of their service, they decided to hold a photo exhibition from photos they took during their service and spoke about the realities of what it means to actually be a military force on a daily basis over a foreign population. And the picture you can see right here is from that original exhibition. And it's basically a group of kids playing, occupier and occupied. The two kids on the right are basically playing soldiers, giving a body check to the three kids on the left. And that's just one picture that, we used back in 2004 to describe what the occupation looks like. Since 2004 until today, we've been doing the same thing. We gather testimonies from soldiers who've served in occupied territories. We have over 1,200 testifiers and thousands of testimonies, and they cover the day-to-day of what it means to be a soldier in occupied territory. What does the system look like, right? What does that control mean? And through our testimonies, we do educational work in which we bring this reality of military control over millions of people to the table and talk about it with those who are willing to listen, especially within Israel, but also with Jewish communities abroad, and of course, supporters around the world, such as yourself. And this is for the point of trying to encourage a moral discussion, right? We're not a legal organization. Our mandate is a moral mandate. And we believe it's important to make the kind of transparent reality that exists in the West Bank and in Gaza visible, and to oppose it until the occupation will come to its end. And just to kind of give an idea of what that means, many soldiers talk about the gap between what they thought they'd do in the territories, which is act as a soldier against a clear enemy, and what they did in the territories, which is policing a civilian population. And I know this gap very well because as a shooting instructor, what I taught soldiers was to be prepared to shoot and learn how to shoot an enemy, right? We would have kind of cartons of soldiers, kind of like of paper, hard paper. And on it, the target would be a soldier, would be someone in a military uniform with a helmet, with a gun facing at you. And that's who we would practice on, right? A clear foreign enemy. But actually, when soldiers come to the West Bank, and I'll shortly show a map of what the West Bank looks like, they found themselves meeting a civilian population. It was a civilian population that they saw in between their gun scopes, not a foreign army. And what they end up doing a lot is activities that are policing activities, such as foot patrols and jeep patrols and stopping and checking people's IDs, setting up flying checkpoints. You can actually see one here on the slide. This is a flying checkpoint. Basically, a few soldiers go, they put up the checkpoint, they make it so you can't pass the road, and then they stop cars, right? And often these acts are described by our testifiers as incredibly random, meaning we don't have any information about someone in that moment. And I just want to open up today to just share one of those many testimonies that we have. And this is a first sergeant from 2016, and he was the commander of this situation. And he says, "There's a story in my eyes which is the weirdest, most messed up, and reflects the reality of ruling over civilians for the sake of ruling." Now I say stop for a second. The army doesn't do it out of an evil will to control human beings. It's just that in order to maintain the situation, which is military rule in the territories, it's what has to be done. We enter villages. For example, we would enter Zeta. Zeta is a small village without many people. We enter the village center, we set up a flying checkpoint. Traffic spikes, a few vehicles, we drive up a small hill and provide cover. What we do is check vehicles. What's checking vehicles? To look in the trunk, to check their IDs, to let them drive away. Now, I don't know what I'm checking for. They told me to check IDs, but they didn't give me the number of a suspect in the village. And even if Ahmed Yassin was there, I wasn't told about it. Nothing. Check them. Check their vehicle. Now, what exactly am I supposed to check in this vehicle? He's driving in his own village. Even if there were knives in there, it's like farmers can also work with them. They're not even in Israel. So you enter the village, you check them, and I don't even know what I'm checking. You cause a traffic jam in a village, about 200, 300 residents, you disrupt this daily life, and after an hour or two, you just pack up and leave. And the interviewer asks him, so what do you check? And he says, nothing. I don't know what I'm checking at all. As a commander, I'm telling you, as the person responsible for the situation, I had no idea what I was doing. And checkposts are really just one example of what we do in occupied territories on a daily basis. And checkposts or flying checkpoints are something we do throughout the West Bank every day, multiple times throughout the day, right? And so our presence is felt widely. And the effect on Palestinians who live in occupied territory in the West Bank, for some Palestinians is daily. And, just to put ourselves in those shoes for a second, if you are Palestinian, you can't know with certainty when you leave your house in the morning if you'll make it to work on time. You might make it to work on time, but there might be a soldier who stops you and checks your car, and they might let you go, or they might dry you out on the side, right? You can never have that certainty. And as for soldiers, we can't both be in occupied territory enforcing the law and not be there in the same time. That's our work. That's our job. And so people often talk about being the moral soldier, right? I'm going to do my best to be a moral soldier. And as Becca, that's exactly what I thought. But even if someone doesn't steal or doesn't hit someone, right, or doesn't take advantage of his power, still, the orders we get as soldiers is to go on a patrol in the middle of the streets, is to enter random people's houses, is to create a flying checkpoint and prevent people from having control over their lives. And so it's because of that, we believe the only real moral option in front of us as soldiers who carried out the system is to end the system, is to end the occupation. And before we continue on with what I want to get in a little bit more into detail today, which is the concept of prevention or deterrence, I do really quickly just want to show a map of the West Bank, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And kind of, I said we want to end the occupation.
Becca, you have enough time.
Okay. Is that your way of saying I should speak slower? So the question is, what is the occupation? After the War of Independence, Jordan annexes the West Bank. Now on the map, you can see Jordan, it's its own country also today, and it occupies and annexes the West Bank. The West Bank becomes a part of Jordan according to Jordanian law. And therefore it gets the name the West Bank, which means the West Bank of the Jordan River, right? In June 1967, however, following the Six-Day War, or as part of the Six-Day War between Israel and multiple Arab countries, Arab neighbors, the IDF forces, the army, occupies the West Bank. We occupy other areas as well, Gaza, the Golan Heights, but today we're going to focus on the West Bank specifically. And since then and until today, the law of the land is that of the Israeli military. And in occupied West Bank today, and you can kind of see it here, this is a map just of the West Bank. And there's about 2.5 million Palestinians and about 400,000 Israeli settlers, okay? In addition to that, there aren't exact numbers because it changes from moment to moment, but there's somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Israeli soldiers at any given moment in the West Bank, okay? And those numbers are really important for what we're going to talk about today, and we'll understand why as we go on. Now, I want to today talk about this concept of prevention. And I think it's a good way to talk about what does the occupied territories look like. And maybe I'll start by saying that, as we can understand from that first testimony I shared, that we can see that a soldier on the ground, and those of us who carried it out, have an understanding that those who haven't spent time in the territories as soldiers don't fully grasp. And you see that gap quite clearly in Israeli society. Those who were there know what it looks like. Those who weren't there don't know. Because again, it's kind of a transparent secret. In Israeli society, we don't talk about the occupation. But in breaking the silence, we've been collecting testimony from soldiers already since the year 2000. So we now have 20 years of testimony. And that means that we have the ability not only to describe the reality, describe what a soldier does, describe what that means for Palestinians, but also to explain some of the logic behind it, right? And I think that's a big question we have to ask ourselves, even from just that one testimony. Why stop random vehicles? Why check IDs, right? Why go into a village midday with no specific intelligence and stop cars? And this is something that, because we have so many testimonies from soldiers for the past 20 years from different units who served in different areas, that we basically can put together and analyze. And there are multiple things that come up with this analysis. There's two I want to talk about today. The first I'll mention quite briefly, and then we'll come back to at the end. And that is this concept of a long-term occupation, which means we have no end date. We don't know when the occupation is going to end. As far as the army is concerned, the command is occupy, is control, right? Not control until a certain date, but just control. And we'll come back to this at the end after I give a little bit more feeling of what this occupation looks like on the ground to understand why that concept is so important and relevant to what we do. The second is this concept of prevention, which you can see on the screen. And prevention is a very common concept that you hear in Israeli society, in the media, in the army itself. And when we say prevention, we're talking about preventing a terror attack. Another word in English I would use to describe it is deterrence, right? In Hebrew, it's what's called sikul. And when we think about deterring or preventing a terror attack, that's what we're thinking about, right? We're thinking about this concept of prevention as something very specific. There's an attack that's about to happen, and we have the ability through our intelligence and through our IDF forces on the ground to prevent that attack, right? But we realize today that the IDF actually utilizes this concept for a much broader purpose than most people realize. And, when one thinks about activities of the IDF in the West Bank, there's this concept that there's a necessity of a security reality, meaning in order for it to be safe in Israel, there must be soldiers in the territories who work to prevent terror attacks by terrorists. And from this, in Israeli society, and I imagine that the same would be true in German society and in general, we have a positive connotation of the idea of prevention. It makes sense. It's preventing something bad. But what we see through our testimonies is that prevention is becoming something very far from deterring a person who is about to commit an attack, and rather that a very wide range of activities fall under this concept that are both aggressive towards the general population and are being done constantly towards them. And I'd like to kind of illustrate that through some examples, such as arrests and house invasions and protests, and kind of give a brief overview and then open it up to questions. So I want to start with this concept of arrests, because I think arrest is maybe feels the most obvious to people, right? when do we go out and arrest people? When there's intelligence on a wanted person who's either already committed an attack or is planning to carry out an attack, you know, and that's really what we think about. It's defensive and it's necessary. And while those examples do exist, and they do exist, there are examples where we have specific intelligence about someone and we stop them in time and we prevent an attack. But they are very much a minority of the arrests that we see being carried out in the West Bank. And so, for example, a first sergeant from the Nachal, which is an infantry brigade, said that as a battalion, they would make a lot of arrests. But if it was a dangerous person, if it was someone that was wanted, that had blood on their hands, that was planning an attack, they would call Duvdevan. Duvdevan is the kind of special forces unit that deals with these type of arrests, right? That deals with the most wanted. And yet we have a testifier from Duvdevan who said that he served in 2006, right after the Second Intifada, and talks a lot about how they ran out of people on the most wanted list. We'd arrested them all, but they still wanted to do arrests. And so constantly they were arresting less and less important people. And so if the vast majority of these arrests aren't kind of, you know, the dangerous, most wanted terrorists, well, then who are they? So a soldier from the Nachshon battalion explained, we would carry out arrests, mostly snack arrests, arrests of all sorts of unimportant people. And a soldier from the Levi battalion who served in Hebron explained that too many people are being arrested. Bamba, snack arrest, we would call it. Just 10-year-olds being arrested. We wouldn't have arrested such serious people. And here you can see an example of this on the screen. Another soldier, oops. Wait. Sorry. Another soldier who served in 2010 also said he was sent out on a mission to arrest someone who apparently stole pens like the writing utensil. And because of this, they were sent to make an arrest. And indeed, when they got to the house to arrest them, they found 4 or 5 boxes of pens, right? And so these are a lot of arrests we see in the West Bank, and we know this from our testimonies, and so many of them that occur on a regular basis. Arrests of teenagers who threw stones, of people who sell drugs, but none of kind of this important terrorist operative we have in our head. And that's kind of one type of general, you know, types of arrests that we do. Another type, which is more specific, is called a pressure arrest or a second circle arrest. And that's basically arresting someone who didn't do anything in order to send a message to someone close to them, a relative perhaps, or a good friend who did do something. So arresting an uninvolved person in order to send a message to someone who is involved, trying to arrest them. And a soldier from the Nachal Brigade in 2014 said he made a lot of pressure arrests under an operation called Cleaning the Stables. And this was in the summer of 2014 in the West Bank, in the northern West Bank. And he says, there are lots of people who you would normally not arrest like that every night. It was clear many more people than usual were being arrested. Anyone who was in any sort of way a Hamas supporter, anyone whose CV had the word Hamas in it, he'd be arrested. If not remanded, then at least questioned. There was also a whole lot of searches conducted. There is really this feeling that now we have an opportunity to do what in normal times we didn't have legitimacy to do, especially with regard to Hamas. Hamas operatives, their relatives, anything. And all of these, kind of the first arrest I talked about, the pressure arrests, are examples which, for one reason or another, specific people are chosen to be arrested. But there's actually examples of arrests in which no specific person is being chosen, but rather many people are being chosen. And that's a mass arrest, right? It's possibly the glaring example of this, in which all the men of a certain age range in an area on a street or in a whole village are basically put under arrest. And a soldier from the Charuv battalion, it's also infantry, shared with us in 2009 how they performed a mass arrest in the village of Chares. And they basically went in the middle of the night, like many soldiers, dozens, and went into every single house in the village around 3 a.m. and arrested all of the men from the year of kind of like teenagers to older men around the age of 50. And they handcuffed them behind their back. They blindfolded them on their eyes. And they took all of them out of their homes. Of course, in that same moment, the children, this is happening in front of their children, their wives, the grandparents, and they take them to the local school. And they're handcuffed this whole time. They're blindfolded. And they basically are kept there for 12 hours. At one point, our testifier tells us that after 7 hours, when they're complaining that the handcuffs are so tight, they release the handcuffs from behind the back and move it to the front. And he goes on to say, and I'll quote him, that those people who were detained wanted to go to the bathroom, and those soldiers who took them to the bathroom just beat them up, cursed them for no reason. They weren't being rude. There was no reason that would give them legitimacy to beat. And at this time, they're still handcuffed, right? They can't see. It's quite a helpless situation. And the reason that the testifier gives for this mass arrest happening is stone throwing, is a person or a group of people from the village throwing stones onto the road. That was the reason his commanders gave him. Now, that might be true. That may have happened, right? It certainly is a thing that happens. But, I think it's a question, can we imagine in Israel, in Germany, and being arrested in the middle of the night, along with everyone else in your neighborhood, because someone, not you, threw stones? It's hard to imagine that happening in Israel, in Germany, in most countries. And here we're seeing basically that this concept of all of these concepts of arrest, if it's a person with blood on their hands who is responsible for a terror attack, or if it's someone who is in the same village where possibly stones were thrown, all of these fall under the concept of preventing terror in the eyes of the army, right? I'll give one more small example on this, and that's a mock arrest. And a mock arrest is exactly what it sounds like. A mock arrest or a fake arrest or a practice arrest are the ways I would translate it into English from Hebrew. And it's basically an arrest where you go in, you make sure that whoever you're going to arrest, it usually happens in the middle of the night. And before you go into their house, you check with the intelligence unit. You make sure that the people inside the house are totally innocent. They're not involved in any terror organization. They're not involved with the PA. They're not involved in anything. And then once you've made sure they're innocent, you go in, often knock on the door, sometimes knock down the door, go into the house, of course, often guns facing towards the family, go into the bedroom, wake the people who are there up, and arrest one of the family members inside. Go through the whole procedure. You handcuff them, you put a piece of fabric on their eyes, and you take them outside to the Jeep. But a moment before driving the Jeep away, you let them go, because it's a mock arrest. It's not real. It's to practice. And a first sergeant from the Nachal Brigade explains in his words that the goals for a mock arrest is mainly a matter of training, of practicing arrests in order to know how to make them. And again, to scare, to alert Palestinian residents, to say there's an army here. And so when we talk about arrests in terms of preventing terror attacks and upholding general security, there are moments that we're talking about, again, very specific arrests we have intelligence on, but we're also talking about totally innocent civilians we've practiced on. And all of these things, when the army talks about it towards soldiers, when higher up commanders tell simple soldiers about it, the way that the media reports on it, the way the army puts the messaging out themselves is that we're getting these missions, we're going out on these missions because we are preventing terror, right? But in practice, we can see that the details of that preventing terror is actually quite constant against often a civilian population. Now, arrests are one example where you can kind of see how this definition has really been expanded, right? To be less specific and more general and constant and aggressive. I want to go into one more example very quickly, and that's house invasions. And I actually want to talk about that because there's been a policy change potentially just over the past few weeks. But first I'll give a short explanation of house invasions because I think it's another explanation that shows how these terms have been expanded, how it's something that goes towards the general population and it's quite constant. Now, there are four main types of military invasions into Palestinian homes in the West Bank. Arrests, which we just talked about. Another one is searches for money and weapons or other items in the home. And what about the other two? There's seizure for operational needs and mappings. And we kind of delve into understand what this type of invasion looks like. Seizures and mappings. And it's important to note as we talk about these invasions that the vast majority occur at night, right? In fact, a recent project that we just did with two other organizations, Doctors for Human Rights Israel, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and Yesh Din, which is an Israeli human rights organization, shows that 88% of the incidents that were documented during the project occurred between midnight and 5 a.m., meaning we're almost always breaking into people's houses in the middle of the night. I think, our house is our safe space. And I think, needless to say, regardless of the reason, may it be an arrest, may it be a search, may it be a mapping, which we'll talk about soon, there's no such thing as a need for a warrant. If you want to go in as a soldier, you can go in. And I think that's one of the big things that's important to understand when we talk about the devastating effects of a long-term occupation is that the things that we consider to be basic rights in the West Bank, they aren't. And I want to give these two examples. The first common practice is a seizure for operational needs. It's what's known as a straw widow. And I believe that's actually originally a German term. And a straw widow is basically a temporary army post that's set up inside a Palestinian home in order to carry out an ambush or to create a lookout down below, right? So you're basically picking an innocent family's house. You then enter the home, multiple troops, full battle gear, often, wearing helmets, often face paint or face masks. You can't even really quite see who's there in front of you. We go into the home and we gather the family. If it happens in the middle of the night, we wake them up, right? And the parents, the children, we gather them into one room in the house. And we then sometimes go and search the house, sometimes not, to see if there's anything there. And then we take it over and we turn it into a lookout for the area below where maybe our troops are walking, or maybe we just want a general lookout at that moment. The way that one soldier who served in Hebron in 2008 put it is, you enter the house of an Arab family without prior notice and you say, I'm going to live in your house in the near future. And sometimes this does include an operation in which there's intelligence about someone from a terror operation or organization who's about to arrive at the scene or is already there, and there's a specific mission to catch them. That sometimes is the case. But there's also straw widows where houses are randomly selected to be used for general observation in an area where the forces are located. And a first sergeant from the paratroopers in 2006 shared an example of that I would like to share with you, in which they randomly picked a house, and as they approached it, they were basically exposed by someone from inside the house. That person started screaming. And if they're exposed, it means the whole neighborhood now will know that there are Israeli soldiers in the middle of this neighborhood, in this case, in the middle of Nablus. And he goes on to say, suddenly from inside the house, we hear someone shouting like an animal. And we were like, they've exposed us. They've seen us. Real shouts, I can't even imitate it. Like something wounded. So the officer and I consult. What should we do? We can't continue, we'll be exposed. He takes his weapon and he breaks the window and points his flashlight into the house. And there's a woman lying there, mentally disabled, old, she can't move. And we see her because we're looking. The family watches her. They don't go in and help her. And I hear myself saying, we've got nothing on this family. Seizing a house is something that every time we do it, inherently, by definition, the family whose house is chosen is not involved in terror or not involved in anything. And the last common reason for invasions is what's called mapping. Mapping is when a soldier enters a house of an innocent Palestinian and we've received word that they're innocent. They enter the house at night and they basically map out the house. They draw it out. And they bring the family into one area and they take their pictures sometimes, right? And if they work, they ask them where they work. If they go to school, they ask them where they go to school, and we write it down. Here you can see a picture of a house being invaded. And here you can see a picture of basically one of those interviews, going into the house, mapping it out, and basically asking the father of the family who's in the house, how old are they, where do they work, where do they go to school. And logic would have it that this mission has intelligence purpose. Yet testifiers most often tell us that they did nothing with the information. They often deleted the pictures or they threw away the maps they drew. Right, these are also maps that just like random soldiers are drawing on a piece of paper. This isn't an architect. And a captain from Hebron explained that they would pick the houses that they had seemingly already mapped before multiple times because they were so close to the Israeli settlements, right? And so testifiers often tell us that the mission of this, or the purpose of this mission, is to create amongst the Palestinian civilian population a feeling of being chased. And I want to just add in here that specifically mapping, just a few weeks ago, the High Court actually ordered the army to stop doing mappings, due in part to the report that we put out last November. At the end of this presentation, I'm happy to send it to you. And the army put out in their own statement that they would stop doing it because they said it does more harm than good to those inside the house, right? And of course, imagine it's not, if we started this presentation with this concept of a check post, you never know when you leave your house if soldiers will be there and stop you. But that also means you can never fully go to sleep knowing if soldiers will enter your house or not. And it's not that we enter the house every day, but we are able to create this feeling of uncertainty amongst the Palestinian population, right? The last thing I'll say about this High Court decision is I really do hope the mappings stop. We have seen, though, practices that have been declared illegal before that continue under different names for years. And so we don't know yet. But to kind of focus on this concept of what I said before, of making our presence felt, this is something that comes up a lot in our testimonies. Kind of this key element is this demonstration of presence, right? And the idea is that if we are constantly present, if Palestinians constantly think we can show up whenever, wherever, for however long, then they'll be too afraid to attack us. And some of the phrases that we hear over and over again are that we want Palestinians to feel that the army is breathing down his neck, right? So he'll never know when we'll appear and what it means, and therefore will be too afraid to attack. a soldier who did reserve duty in 2018, so quite recently, said his commander, his officer told him that our purpose of making our presence felt is to show who owns the house, right? And that there be this sense of persecution or a feeling of being chased amongst the Palestinian population. And I realize this seems quite harsh, but I think it's important to understand, if I bring us back to the numbers that we talked about, there are 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Israeli soldiers. They are very, we are few. And so we have very little control actually over many people that we rule over, that we control, who don't want us to control them, right? And so by making our presence felt, and all of these basically practices that we talked about are part of this concept of making our presence felt. Checkposts and mass arrests and mock arrests, entering random houses, are all actually a part of fulfilling that order of making our presence felt. And the disorder that it creates amongst the Palestinian population, for us in the army, it gives us order. It allows us to control successfully. And I think it's important to say, I went over mock arrests and mappings, and those are things that train us as soldiers how to enter a house, right? But it also trains the Palestinians to be a controlled population, to show them who's boss. And I kind of want to start wrapping up this, what does this all mean? And what it all means is that for us, it obscures who is a legitimate target and who isn't in the West Bank, because presence is towards everyone. And you can see this really well in our definitions of the Palestinian population in the West Bank. There are two types of people in the West Bank: involved and uninvolved. Someone who is involved in terror and someone who's uninvolved in terror. Or in other words, those who are uninvolved in terror are a potential threat, right? They could one day become involved in terror. And therefore we need to prevent that already now. Innocent isn't part of our army lingo. It's not part of our definition, right? And so just to give a short example of, I think, what this really looks like on the ground in the West Bank, that I think shows that obscuring of who is and is not a legitimate target, is that of protests. And what I have here on the screen is Kfar Kadum. Kfar Kadum is a Palestinian village in the northern West Bank, and it's in the area of Nablus, and it's seemingly been around for hundreds of years. And in the 1980s, the settlement of Kadumim was built right next to Kfar Kadum. Now, to leave Kfar Kadum, you basically go down and follow my mouse. You basically go down this road, and then you go past Jit Junction. This is the town, Palestinian village of Jit. Go past Jit Junction, continue. And in about 10-15 minutes, you get to Nablus. Nablus is the major city in the area, right? Kfar Kadum can't function today without Nablus. But at some point in the early 2000s, Kadumim, which is here on the lower center part of the map, expands. Now this is a settlement. When the settlement expands, you can now see that the connecting road between the settlement and the areas in which people live in the newer part of the settlement is right next to the road where Palestinians from Kfar Kadum, the road that they need to drive to go to Nablus. And so since the early 2000s, this road has been cut off. Palestinians can't use it. In the army, we call it sterile. Sterile roads, or roads the Palestinians aren't allowed to go on. They're clean from Palestinians. And they haven't been able to use this road for well over a decade. And so they have to take a circuitous route to Nablus. Instead of taking 10, 15 minutes to get to Nablus, it takes 45 minutes to an hour, right? They have to go totally around. And so every single Friday, they have a protest to open the road. And I just want to explain from the eyes of our soldiers how these protests go. And the soldier who served there in 2014 from the OLEV unit, which is a special forces unit, says, I remember we would often reach a situation in which we got mad and tried to shoot at them directly with the Ringo gas, which is a tear gas launcher. To the credit of my commander, he was often angry about that. Not only he didn't do anything. We knew it was forbidden, but you're in a tempest there. You're hit by stones, you find yourself shooting directly, meaning shooting tear gas directly, shooting tear gas grenades directly at the body of a demonstrator rather than at an angle above them, which is required. And you know the rules are not, it's not okay, but in fact, at some stage, you feel as though we're not doing anything here. We're being hit by stones, we're shooting all sorts of gas, and they, the demonstrators, don't mind the gas, and you feel hopeless, because what are you actually doing here every Friday? And then you say, we'll shoot them, we'll do something. If somebody throws stones directly at us, we'll try and hit them directly. And it all seems very parallel and sensible at the time. And just to understand, right, we have two kind of groups here. We have the group of Palestinians who are here protesting, and the soldiers say they never quite make it past this area. And the soldiers coming up from up here, right? The Palestinians are throwing rocks, throwing tires, and the soldiers are throwing tear gas launchers, sometimes rubber-coated bullets, at the protesters, right? And another soldier from OEV, the same unit in 2014, added that he always wondered why we were doing it at all, because they'll never cross the fence. They know that it would mean losing their leg, if not their life. And the essence of this protest, as I see it, is a group of people, Palestinian in this case, trying to make their voices heard, trying to lift their heads. And lifting their heads is one of the things that we're told in the army that we need to demonstrate presence against in the West Bank. And we see this in multiple examples, right? Because one way actually that we deal with these protests is that we find the primary instigator, right? Which means the person organizing everyone. We're more interested in the person with the microphone than the people with stones. And we take those people down. And we see it in the way that we arrest people. A soldier who served in Pausar Nachal, another special forces unit in 2014, said that one night they actually went into the village of Kadum on Thursday night, the night before the protest, and arrested about 12 young men, some of them teenagers, so that they wouldn't be able to protest the next day. And they held them until the next day, right? And so they weren't even given the opportunity to protest, the right to protest. And I think it's very understandable as an Israeli, the narratives that we've been raised on to hear about Palestinians protesting and feel uncomfortable. But the essence is actually quite the same as protests around the world, right? I'm sure you have protests in Germany, in Israel. For over a year, there are weekly protests in Balfour, which is right outside of the Prime Minister's residence, in which people were protesting for a different system, for a better life, for a better future, right? And the essence is the same as what those in Kfar Kadum are doing as well. Protesting for a better life, right? Protesting in this specific circumstance to open the road so that they can easily get to the city they rely on so fully. But this same right that's granted to us as Israelis, and the right to protest is granted to us because, of course, you know, democratic system, it's one of the highlights of a democratic system. It's systemically denied to Palestinians and has been since 1967. Since 1967, there's what's known as Military Order 101, which basically says more than 10 Palestinians, not only can they not protest, but it's illegal for more than 10 Palestinians to gather and have a political discussion. And I think it's very difficult to hear about this and to look at protests and equate it to terror. It's clearly different. But for the military, the concept goes hand in hand, because the assumption of the military and the assumption of the occupation is that it is a zero-sum game, meaning it's us or them. Either they can be safe or we can. And therefore, our control must have a totality. And so in the eyes of the military, prevention or deterrence is not only stopping a terror attack, but also a protest. It's stopping or preventing anything in which Palestinians inherently lift their heads up. Protests, people's committees, functioning schools, NGOs, right? And the state and army understand that there's a threat here, but it's a threat to the existing situation in the territories, to the status quo of our control, and not necessarily to immediate danger to the lives of Israelis. And so to conclude, when we talk about this concept of prevention, the framework in which the army sees it is that in order to uphold our security based on zero-sum measures, what are we preventing? We're preventing terror, but more regularly, we're preventing the ability for civilians to feel their own agency to control their lives. And we do this by demonstrating our presence, by creating checkpoints, by entering people's houses at night, by performing mass arrests and mock arrests. And we do it towards everyone. If you are born in the West Bank as a Palestinian under the occupation, there is nothing you can do to ensure that your house won't be entered, that your ID won't be checked, that you won't be detained at the side of the checkpoint, that you can go on the road in Kfar Kadum. There's nothing you can do to ensure that. And in order to make sure that this presence of felt is constant, we are making our presence felt constantly. We are constantly, as an army, creating random chaos and, randomly choosing a house for a straw widow, randomly choosing a roof that we go on during a patrol. And so we do it towards the general population. And of course, those who decide to defy that concept, right, do something like protesting, which is inherently a form of making your voice heard, of lifting your head up, of demanding rights, immediately those are put down. And that's what we see happen in protests week after week, month after month, year after year. And in the eyes of the army, because it's a zero-sum game, meaning we can have a functioning society or they can, it's indefinite. It has no time limit, right? And often when people talk about occupation, they talk about this concept of the day after. What will the society look like who is under occupation the day after we left? But we don't have that concept here. We are functioning in the army as though we're here indefinitely. And it's important to say that's not an army decision, that's our state's decision. That's a government decision, right? This is a civilian issue. It is a civilian choice. It is the choice of our government to occupy. In the end of the day, the army is carrying out the mission, and the mission's indefinite. But it's important to say that at Breaking the Silence, we don't believe in this zero-sum game. We are very critical of that. There is no way that it is us or them, right? It's either us and them together. It is all of us figuring out our shared destiny or indefinite violence. And for those of you who followed what happened in May, there was a lot of violence here. Another round of violence. Another round of so many rounds that I've been through. And such a reality is going to continue as long as we control another people. And I get it. A lot of people talk about what would be the solution. It's such an uncertain future, and it is an uncertain future. But uncertain future cannot uphold current injustice, especially after just going through kind of talking about what we just talked to. We can understand that prevention in many ways is against Palestinian livelihood. And as Becca, as a former IDF soldier and as an Israeli citizen, I ask myself, what right do I have? What right do we have to deny someone's humanity? And I think just as us, those of you who are here listening, and I thank you very much for being with me, just as us, you also have a moral obligation now that you've heard some of this to speak out against the injustice, because it's happening in all of our names, right? We have a responsibility, even if we didn't start this reality, we still have a responsibility to call out injustice where it's happening and to call out the reality in which we're indefinitely controlling the lives of Palestinians, of daily actions, and in the most private places in people's homes, right? For me, it's the people living beside me, it's my neighbors. You know, many people say it's naive to believe another way is possible, but I think it's naive to believe that this can go on forever. And, you know, I'll end with this one last thought, is that the answer is not how do we solve the conflict, right? The question is not how, you know, what's the right solution for this conflict? But rather, the question we need to be asking is how do we repair the injustice that is being caused also in this moment due to the occupation? And with that, I will finish and would be very happy to hear people's thoughts, opening up to questions and answers. So Heinz, I return it to you.
Well, Becca, thanks a lot for the impressive presentation, for describing the situation in the occupied territories, and for giving us an idea what some soldiers think about the injustice which is happening there and where they are unfortunately part of. Filippo, are there some questions in the chat so far?
Right now, there is not yet any question in the chat, so maybe I want to invite everyone among the spectators to give their in written form as comments here in the chat their questions or.
So please do so, as we have Rebecca or Becca online. Well, then I will start with a question. You mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that the Israeli people, the Israeli society, doesn't like to be aware of what happens in the occupied territories. What's your status as an organization within the Israeli society? I guess you are not only well beloved, but also not so welcome. Can you give us an idea? How are you doing the work? How is it seen? How is it? What are the feedback you get from people in Israel?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for asking. You know, it's interesting because people, a lot of what I talked about right now, again, for soldiers who weren't there, who didn't carry it out, they don't know it exists. Almost no Israeli can tell you what a straw widow is. Almost no Israeli can tell you what a mapping is, or that mock arrests happen. You know, I mentioned that the High Court just decided to stop the practice of mapping. Now, we don't know if the practice will end or not, but the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the day before that decision came out, I actually was standing in a kind of info booth and was talking to a bunch of, you know, fellow Israelis. And I told someone about mapping, and they said to me, that doesn't exist. That doesn't happen. And then the next day, the army admitted that it happens and that they're stopping the practice, right? That's how much people don't know what's going on, that, you know, a major decision can be, it can be decided to stop doing a major practice. And up until that moment, most Israelis had no idea it was even a practice that we do in occupied territories. And so that kind of leads me into your question of, how are we seen? Well, I think often it's an uphill battle because it's hard to see us in, I think, a very positive light sometimes when people don't recognize the reality of what's happening in occupied territory. It's hard for people to believe that we are trying to bring about, knowledge about this injustice in order to end it, because most people don't really know what's happening. There's been multiple campaigns against us, especially in the years of 2015 and 16, we were widely attacked. And the reason that I see for being so attacked actually is because, it's not just that people don't know that the occupation exists, it's that there's a lot of efforts to make sure that people don't know the occupation exists, right? There's a lot of efforts to not talk about it in school. Most 18-year-old Israelis today have never seen a map with the green line on it. They don't know what the West Bank looks like. To them, it's just part of Israel, even though it's not officially, right? It's not part of the country. And so I believe a lot of the public campaigns and attacks that happen towards us is because when you tell soldiers who carried out the occupation that we don't have a right to talk about it, then who does have a right to talk about it, right? And it's basically another way to make sure this conversation isn't happening. I'll basically just kind of end this answer and say, even though by many Israelis we're considered, to be kind of a bug in the system, or, a lot of people question our legitimacy and our truthfulness. Even though that's one reality, the other reality is that, we meet with more Israeli youth than any other anti-occupation group in Israel. We have so many supporters, and there is, a perhaps small but strong democratic camp in Israel who does see that the occupation is happening and support our work. And we're incredibly grateful for it, and basically allow us to bring this knowledge and information to more and more people on a daily basis.
If your members of Breaking the Silence give testimony about what they've seen in the occupied territories, I guess this makes a lot of conflicts within their families. Because I guess most of the family will be pro-army, and these guys have seen things which are not correct, which are no justice. So do you know how this is handled within by the members of your organization, the conflict in the families?
Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, I'll say it's not even just what we've seen, it's what we did, I mean, every soldier who's talking about entering a house, that soldier entered that house. And, I can say personally, I think that my parents aren't Israeli, they're American, but my dad, our families are Jerusalemites, of course, Israeli. And I think that my dad really struggled with it in the beginning, because it feels intuitively, it feels like it's going against the country. It's going, even I would say for someone like my dad, is going against the Jewish people.
You're sort of traitors also.
Yeah, people call us traitors a lot. In fact, it's quite common, and you really see it between family members as well. I think it's a feeling, I don't think most people at Breaking the Silence could put it this way, but because I'm gay, I feel comfortable saying it's a little bit like a process of sometimes coming out of the closet, in a much different way, but in that you realize that something's immoral. You realize that you want to be truthful about what you saw and what you did, and the rest of society doesn't see that. And which, just to clarify, I don't think being gay is immoral. I think it's great. But I mean the concept of coming out and people not knowing about it beforehand, right? But it's important to say that I think a lot of the families of silence breakers, of our testifiers, start out as often surprised, sometimes unsupportive, sometimes shocked. But people move, right? People hear more stories. They come with us to Hebron. They come like where we do tours, and they realize that what we're talking about is the reality, and that we're talking about it because we're trying to make this place better for all of us. And in that, a lot of families, in what starts out as a moment of conflict, ends up with a lot of support. I can say personally that, you know, my friends and family today are incredibly supportive. They have my back. You know, that wasn't the case for all of them. I also lost friends when I decided to speak out against the occupation, and later when I decided to join Breaking the Silence. But you know, it's always a process, and I think it's going to continue to be a process for those who break silence. But I'm happy that there's so many of us who feel the moral urgency in doing so, and that for many of us, our families are right behind us, as is much of society.
Okay, so I see two questions in the chat. The first one is, what do you think can be done from Germany to support your work? The second is, hello, Becca, thank you very much for the inside view. Can you please tell about how your organization is accepted or not so in the younger ranks of the IDF?
Yeah, so I'll try and answer those quickly. Actually, sorry, I was then reading the second one along with you. Can you remind me what the first question was? Because it's in German and now I forgot.
The first question was just, how could we in Germany, who are in favor of your work, support your organization?
Right. And I think this is very important because I believe that everyone has something that they can do to bring about an end to this injustice and an end to this military control. And so I'll start by saying that, you know, the occupation is happening in international territories. That means that every country has legitimacy and the right to be involved, right? That's what makes it an international issue. And I think for the German community, that means, like many groups in Europe, in the West, you know, putting pressure on your members of parliament, on the EU. You know, there's a lot of money even that ends up going into occupied territories, even though people don't necessarily know it's going towards occupied territories, right? A lot of private donations, a lot of institutional donations. If you're giving your money to something that's happening here, ask first and foremost where it's going to, right? Of course, we're very happy, Breaking the Silence, we believe in supporting Israel, but that does not mean supporting the occupation. In fact, we believe the true way to support this place is to end our military occupation. The other thing is, of course, getting educated, just like you're doing right now, and being active. There are protests that you can take part in. You know, we know a lot of groups around the world who even kind of have sister villages in the West Bank, and, you know, raise money for them, protest alongside with them against whatever injustice it is they're facing. May it be them not being able to walk on the road, or, you know, there's a lot of what happens in the West Bank of facing home demolitions and settler violence. And these are practical things that I think also show a lot of solidarity towards those who are under occupation, and that we're all in this together and we're all working to end it. And, you know, at the very, very least, talk about it with other people, and, you know, encourage other people to get educated, to come on a Breaking the Silence tour if they're in the region. And, you know, we'd love to host lectures such as this one, or presentations. We also do a virtual tour of Hebron. At the very, very least, talking about to people and getting educated and at the most actively protesting, working with Palestinian communities, working with Israelis, such as Breaking the Silence. But of course, we're just one group out of many who are actively trying to end this reality. And again, the last thing I'll say is be aware of what your money is supporting, because support is also financial. The other question was, how do the lower kind of ranks of the IDF, the younger ranks, what do they think about us? I'll answer this in two ways. I mean, we give tours in Hebron and the South Hebron Hills, which is a rural area. So we're constantly meeting soldiers. Most soldiers give testimony after they're done with their service. It's very hard to give testimony while you're in your service. It's very hard to be so reflective in the moment and keep doing what you're doing. And for a lot of people, the kind of like light bulb doesn't go off beforehand. And so I think a lot of the IDF soldiers that we meet, a lot of them don't like us because of our name, Breaking the Silence, but actually a lot of them hear what we do. We talk about the fact that, look, we're saying there's no moral way to do the occupation, right? We're not blaming the soldiers. We are the soldiers. But when we get the command to enter a house, when we get the command to do a checkpoint, we realize there's no way to control a population that doesn't want us to be controlled. We believe we shouldn't be sent to upholding a political situation. A lot of times when you talk to soldiers in Hebron who are the ones literally upholding that political situation in that moment, there's a lot of understanding between us and between them. So it really depends. We do also work with young people around the age of 18 before they enter the army. We meet hundreds of pre-military academy students or participants every year. And I think a lot of them come into it with quite a lot of disagreement, and then actually find that when we're standing in the center of Hebron, which again, I believe I mentioned in the beginning, is the only Palestinian city with an Israeli settlement in it. And I talked about the sterilization of the road of Kadum. Well, in Hebron, the whole entire city center basically is sterilized. And when you have a group of 18-year-old Israelis standing in a sterilized area, using that terminology and understanding the impacts that it has on the Palestinians of the city, and of course the soldiers carrying it out, you actually get a lot more people saying, yeah, actually, we agree with you. It's not necessarily we agree with you and, that's it. From now on, we're activists against the occupation, but there's much more of a common language, I think, than people would expect. Which is why, again, there's so many attacks on us as an organization by the right wing, because they know that when we actually take youth and we talk to them about what's going on and encourage them to be active citizens fighting against the occupation, it works. And so the best way to prevent that conversation from happening is to put pressure on society to not want to meet with us, right? To kind of give us a bad name. Because when we're actually meeting with people, you see the wheels turning, you see the impact that it has. We've had multiple soldiers who met us before their army service and came and gave testimony after their army service because of the meeting they had with us beforehand.
Yeah, thank you. So I see a question here. I'll try to read it. Dear Becca, thank you so much for speaking out and sharing with us what has been unknown to many of us. Could you explain how testimonies are collected? Do you approach former members of the military, or do they approach your organization? Have you been facing negative reactions such as intimidation or threats from former or current members of the military, or even others outside the military, regarding the work you do?
Yeah, so great question. So we have over 1,200 testifiers, and all of these testifiers are soldiers or former soldiers, and that we basically sit down with an interview. That's not my job, but there is a whole entire department who's responsible for collection of testimonies. And we sit with the interviewee, and they tell us, when they served, where they served, And then, basically different stories, different moments in their time serving in occupied territories. Sometimes we approach them, and sometimes we approach them, sometimes it's like a friend brings a friend. So someone, says, oh, I think this person would be interested in giving testimony, and we reach out to them. A lot of the people who end up giving testimony, we've managed to reach through our educational work, which my department is responsible for. And in that sense, we really try and work with a lot of young people and kind of in their early 20s, right after the army, because that's both the time when people are interested in giving testimony and also when people become civilians again after the army and can become active civilians in trying to end the occupation. So sometimes they approach us, sometimes we approach them. A lot of it is done through our educational work, which I'm super proud about. And then we basically sit down with them and go through the testimonies. They're then kind of put into shorter stories. It's a whole interview. It could take like 2 hours. I did it. And then, of course, from there on, it goes to a process of intense verification to making sure that everything that the testifier said is true. And only once we've ensured that it's been verified, its truthfulness, we basically put it out into the world. We publish it on our website, and we have booklets of testimonies. We actually have a booklet of testimonies coming out next week about settler violence. So sometimes they're themed. Have we faced negative reactions or intimidations or threats? Absolutely. Again, in the period of 2015 and 16, when we were being heavily attacked, we weren't just being attacked by, it wasn't we were being attacked by society. There were purposeful attacks against us. We actually had moles, people who were placed into our organization to try and give false testimony to show that we're liars, kind of planted in the organization. We never published their testimony because we couldn't verify it. But that's just one example. And actually, after someone shared their testimony publicly, and that testifier, his name is Dean, was accused of lying. And it went up as far as the prime minister saying that a case should be opened up against breaking the silence multiple times. At one point, the prime minister, at one point, the justice minister, at one point, the minister of defense. So it's not only that we've actually been attacked, we've been attacked from the government, from within the government itself. That was a few years ago. We have come, I think we're in a place today where people realize it's not that we're not truthful, it's that many, many people in the government who want to continue occupying, who want to even annex, right, and make the situation more permanent, don't want Israeli society to hear what we as former soldiers have to say.
Okay, I see another question and a statement. Give me just a second. The statement is, when you criticize Israeli politics here in Germany, you are often accused of being anti-Israelist, anti-Semitic. That's true. And the question is, hi again, thanks for the answer. I'm also interested if there is any resonance of your work on the Arab side. Do you have any partner organizations or people there to work with? Greetings from Hamburg.
Yeah, so I'll start with the kind of, if people criticize, they're called out for being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. I realize that this is a real issue that people face abroad. And I want to say, as an Israeli and as a Jewish person, that it is absolutely okay to criticize Israeli policy of how we control another people. It doesn't make you anti-Israel. It doesn't make you anti-Semitic. Now, maybe you are a staunch supporter of Israel, maybe not, right? But they're being Jewish and the Israeli state are not one and the same, right? And so giving legitimate critique, and of course, not all critique is legitimate, but giving legitimate critique of a country's policies that it's carrying out to a foreign population on their land, of course, is okay, it's legitimate. And to those who say that it's anti-Semitic, I totally disagree with that. It's not against me as a Jewish person. I think it goes back, and I don't even think it's anti-Israel, right? It's maybe against specific anti-Israeli policies, but I genuinely believe that the most important thing we can do right now to ensure the future of Israel is to bring about an end to the occupation. The occupation is today the largest threat, the most important, biggest threat to the success of Israel as a country, as a democracy, as a thriving society. I realize that it's a critique you get. I think it's, goes hand in hand with many people who want to, the Israeli right, amongst others, who want to continue occupying, right? It's when people are being called out after making legitimate critique as being anti-Semitic, well, who is that actually benefiting? It's benefiting those who want to continue the occupation. And sometimes I think, okay, so if we can't critique Israeli policies, and I even say me as a Jewish person, as an Israeli, if I can't critique what my country is doing to the Palestinian population in occupied territory, right? That if that makes me anti-Semitic, it means that inherently to be pro-Israel or even to be pro-Jewish, right? Or to care about the Jewish people inherently means controlling another people. I don't believe that. As a Jewish person, I completely disagree with that option. It is my Judaism and my love for my religion, my people, and my society that causes me to stand out. Now, I understand how hard it is to be constantly being accused of being anti-Semitic or being anti-Israel. But if your if your critique is legitimate on this policy, then please know that the work you're doing is hard, and we are with you. And I disagree. I don't think it means that you're anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, and it's important to give that voice even when people are saying it.
Oh, this answers the next question, which I read. When you accuse injustice against Palestinians, you are accused of being anti-Jewish. How would you argue? I guess you just answered that, or want you to add some comments?
No, I think that's more or less what I answered.
Yes. Okay, the next question, could you tell us a bit from inside? How was the shouting of unarmed Palestinians during the Great March of Return discussed and perceived among young active recruits, young active soldiers? How were they motivated to shoot? Was it hard to turn them into cold, premeditated murderers? Oh, this is hard. Okay.
Yeah, so the shootings that happened during the March of Return in 2018, in which over 60 people were killed in the course of a day, and many more over the course of those few months, and many more who were not killed but were shot and left disabled. Maybe I'll start by saying that Israel doesn't really remember it. It's interesting, how is it perceived? It happened on the same day that the United States moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and it happened on the same day that Neta won the Eurovision. And if you ask Israelis, that's what they remember. Probably the Eurovision more than the embassy, but meaning the horrible shootings and killings that happened during the March of Return are really not very present in our consciousness. And I actually, to be honest, didn't quite realize that myself until quite recently, when one of our testifiers talks about that was his moment of kind of having a political change of heart. And when he talks about it with pre-military academies and with different Israeli groups, Israelis under that kind of in that age don't remember that it happened. They don't know. How is it being perceived during those months? Defense. I think it was interesting. There's a lot of people were protesting for the most part around 400 meters from the border, and most conversations I was having with Israelis at the time, and I just joined Breaking the Silence at the time, was people were under the impression, even when the headline said people protesting 400 meters from the border, people showing up 400 meters from the border, the idea in the mind of most people was that millions of Palestinians or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are storming the border, right? Are breaking down the separation wall. And so there was a very large gap as what people thought. And I do want to say kind of a little bit the motivation to shoot. I think it goes back to this concept that I talked about in my presentation of what's considered, the fact that no one's considered innocent. Everyone's involved or uninvolved, right? And I can say personally, when I was a shooting instructor and I worked with soldiers, just like the soldiers who went there, you teach them for 8 months or sometimes 14 months, depending on the type of soldier and the type of job they're doing, that you're going out to kind of to deal with an enemy. And a lot of that dehumanization starts before you even enter the occupied territories, right? Because first of all, you go through the whole entire school system and you don't really talk about Palestinians or Palestinian narrative or identity or the occupation. And then you meet someone like me, a shooting instructor, and I would teach people shooting. And at the same time, I would wear a shirt that said something like, it would have a target on it on the back. And it would be a target that as though you were looking through the scope of the gun, and you would see a person falling to the ground. And it would say something like, 1 shot, 1 kill. Or every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you. These are kind of the dehumanizing messages that I was sending to soldiers who then just a couple months later, sometimes a month or two later, found themselves dealing with a civilian population. There's no aha moment like, just kidding, we're not sending you to war. We're going to be policing a civilian population for the next 2 years. That moment doesn't exist, but rather soldiers go into occupied territory and we constantly think, okay, this is our enemy. This is who we need to protect against. All of these people are potential terrorists, right? Achia, a testifier, and who we also worked for many years in the organization, was in Duvdevan. And the job of Duvdevan is to basically put itself inside the Palestinian population and from there find, kind of get people who are involved in terror. It's a very, very elite unit. And when he joined Breaking the Silence, one of the things he said was, wow, I'd love to give testimony, but I don't think I met any Palestinians during my service. Now, this was following the fact that the amount of, the dozens, if not more, homes that he entered, the constant interactions with Palestinians that he carried out. But when he came to Breaking the Silence, he said his first thing was not even realizing he'd met Palestinians. That's how much we don't see them. We're trained to not see them as innocent, as civilians. It's a very harsh reality, but I hope it can also be understood that, we're taught when joining the army that that's the moral thing to do, that's the, that we're protecting our society, our family, right? I remember, during one of the rounds with Gaza, where I thought maybe I'd be called up to reserve duty, and thinking to myself, I have this question as to if I want to go or don't go, but I want to be I want to do my society well. I want to be moral. I want to be good to them, without quite realizing yet the immorality of what we were doing. And you can break into someone's home on Thursday, on Friday, go home in your army uniform, have dinner with your family. They don't ask you what you're doing. They shake your hand. They tell you how proud they are of you, right? I remember going home to my synagogue in Philadelphia during my service, and every single person in the synagogue shook my hand and said, thank you for protecting us, right? And maybe from the outside, it seems obvious that the people on the border of Gaza, and I agree, I think today as a civilian and obviously very critical, to me, it's obvious that they're civilians, but to the people carrying it out, that psychological process is very, very strong. It's very strong. And the people who were doing it have they see them as there's a process of dehumanization. You know, I don't know how else to say it.
Thank you. This was a very impressive explanation of what military and war makes with people.
Yeah. I think maybe our time is coming to an end, but I would like to finish on a slightly more hopeful note, if I may.
I would like to ask one last question.
Yes, of course.
You work for the end of the occupation.
Mhm.
What after that? There are a lot of solutions, two-state solution, binational state. Everyone is as complicated and as far away as the other. But I'd like to ask your idea. How do you see a possible solution, even it's far away?
Yeah, so at Breaking the Silence, we really are quite, you know, geared towards ending the occupation. I really think there are multiple solutions on the table. There's not a lack of solutions, there's a lack of political will to carry them out. I don't know exactly what will come after, but I think that one of the things that keeps me going is, first of all, obviously there has to be equal rights for everyone. It can be one state, it can be two states, it can be a federation, but everyone has to have equal rights. They're basic human rights that if I wasn't being given them, I would not, I wouldn't be able to kind of, you know, I wouldn't live with that situation. And so I think that the most important way of looking at it is not asking really what is the solution, but rather how do we get political will? And I think the political will that we need involves, and this answers your question, Michelle, sorry I missed it, working with Palestinians, working in partnership. And we have partners who we work with on a daily basis in Hebron and the South Hebron Hills. Some of our partners for 10 years, 20 years, nonviolent activists as well, from multiple villages in the South Hebron Hills who face, you know, daily settler violence and you know, also demolitions. And in Hebron, a group called Youth Against Settlements, which is a nonviolent group fighting the occupation. And I think what really we need to do right now is to sit down with our Palestinian partners and both be in solidarity and also understand, what does justice look like? I think there really is such a desire to think, okay, what's a political solution? If we have a political solution, it will just, you know, it'll just be the end. But we thought that founding the state of Israel was the political solution, right? And then the occupation came, and that's obviously turned out to not work, right? Now, again, maybe in the end, the solution will be the two-state solution, and, you know, things will more or less stay the same without the occupation. I don't know. But what we have to be asking ourselves is not, you know, a lot of ways that Israelis put it is, how do we fix the Arab problem? No, we don't need to fix the Arab problem. It's not a problem, it's an injustice. And for every injustice, there is a way to repair the world and repair and heal ourselves and our society. And the first step towards doing that is what Breaking the Silence does. And that's talking about the reality and showing the reality for how it exists today. And I'm very hopeful that by doing so, we are bringing ourselves closer to a reality in which all of us have equal rights and are free from the control of another people and another army.
Dear Becca, thank you very much for the impressive presentation. Given the huge role the IDF plays in Israel, I can really state you are a civil, courageous organization. I wish you all the best for the future. Thank all participants for asking questions and listening to Becca, and have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.